picture of an animal. Now, without saying anything out loud, I want you to think of what that animal is. Don't say anything to the person next to you or discuss it with people around you. Just have that animal name in your head. Now, raise your hand if you see a duck. Okay. Now raise your hand if you see a rabbit. Okay. So now that you know that this animal is either a duck or a rabbit, I want you to try to see the opposite of what you saw at first. So if you saw a rabbit, I want you to try to see a duck and vice versa. Do you see it? That phenomenon that you just experienced is called a paradigm shift. The technical definition of a paradigm shift is when a scientific activity or experiment begins to contradict premises previously considered unshakable by experts. Basically, a paradigm shift is what happens when your perspective on something shifts entirely. It's that feeling of, oh my God, what just happened? That was something, and now it's something else. It's kind of like that feeling when you're walking out of a really good movie and your entire world is rocked. That's a paradigm shift. But okay, big deal. You can look at a couple different pictures, a couple different ways. What's the big fuss about? Well, this phenomenon doesn't just pertain to visual images. Like with any idea or scenario, people have different viewpoints. And especially in today's climate, everyone seems to be on opposite sides of some argument. Whether it be about guns, books, even bathrooms, everyone is somehow arguing with everyone. And this is especially prevalent in politics. I got to witness this firsthand. A Republican and a Democrat go head-to-head live from my grandmother's kitchen table back in 2016 during the Trump versus Clinton election. So what happened was, my dad, my brother, and I went to go visit my grandmother for a day when we saw that her cousin, my Aunt Margaret, was already there. And what you have to know about my grandmother and my Aunt Margaret is that they're very religious, conservative, traditional Republican women, while my dad is a moderately liberal Democrat who absolutely hates Trump. Yeah, we had two different political extremes all sitting together at the same table drinking coffee. Needless to say, it was pretty interesting. So after they talked to each other for a little bit, my dad, being the well-informed person who loves to talk about politics, brought up the election, and the whole conversation quickly got heated. And I don't remember what exactly was said, but I remember how loud it was said and how angry they got with each other without even listening. So then, after they got on each other's nerves pretty well, my Aunt Margaret turns to me and she tells me, don't listen to your father. Don't let him influence what you believe. You need to form your own opinions. Which got my dad even more upset. So now I had two adults yelling at me not to believe the other because the other person was wrong and they themselves were right. Mind you, I was 9, so I really didn't care too much about what was happening. I was just entertained by all the chaos, and I took away absolutely nothing from the argument. I wasn't swayed to one side or the other. I just went about my day like any other 4th grader would. Now, I was a little kid, so I wasn't too concerned with the magnitude of the argument. But sometimes I look back, and I wonder what that would have been like had I been a little bit older, after I had formed my own thoughts and ideas. Would I have been as amused as I was? Or would I have become uncomfortable? Being in an environment where people are constantly expressing these strong, opposing ideas with their my way or the highway mindsets can make a lot of people feel like they can't truly express their ideas and they can't have important conversations that they need to have. Especially with family, who's supposed to be your safe space, but instead they're treating the whole conversation as an argument instead of just what it is, a conversation of diverse thoughts. This just goes to show how crucial paradigm shifts are to the way we communicate with each other and our understanding of the world. In fact, some of the most important ideas and innovations in science have come from paradigm shifts, from these ideas that challenge the status quo and challenge us to change the way we see the world. For example, until 1676, people thought that if you got sick, it was because of bad air, because something in the atmosphere was wrong, and that was what was making you sick. People believed this until a man named Antony van Leeuwenhoek discovered It wasn't bad air making me sick, it was bacteria. And that's huge because bacteria affects our everyday lives, including our health and the environment. People couldn't see the bacteria, so they didn't know it was there. But that just proves that just because you don't see something at first doesn't make it invalid. So, this duck-rabbit illusion, it was drawn by a psychologist named Joseph Jastrow, and he used it to conduct a study to see how quickly people could shift between the two animals. And he found that the quicker people were able to make that shift, the quicker their brains were, and therefore the more creative they were. And what I found really cool about the whole thing was that depending on what time of year he performed the experiment, the results changed. So around Easter, more people would see the rabbit, which makes sense because of the Easter bunny. While in October, more people would see the duck. That one doesn't make as much sense to me, but maybe there's some sort of secret duck phobia I don't know about. Either way, this proves that our environment is a huge factor in the way we see the world, and that our perception of reality isn't solely based on preconceived biases. Let's take a look at another example. This picture is called My Wife and My Mother-in-Law, and it depicts both a young woman and an old woman, depending on how you see it. And in 2018, researchers from the University of Southern Australia conducted a study to see how many people saw one image, how many people saw the other. And they found that social in-groups was a big factor in the results. A social in-group is basically just a group of people that all have a shared characteristic. They all have something in common so they can all relate to each other. This meant that younger people saw the young woman, while older people saw the older woman. And there are tons of more examples of optical illusions and visual paradigm shifts. But now that you understand the basics, let's talk about the more philosophical paradigm shifts. One of the most famous examples of idealism and the shift in perception is the allegory of the cave, written by Plato. In this story, Plato talks about these prisoners that are chained to the wall of the cave. Their hands and feet have been bound since the day they were born, and they've been staring at the cave, into the darkness, their whole lives. Behind them is a fire, which projects light onto the wall of the cave, and there are two men holding up puppets that make shadows for the prisoners to see. But what the prisoners don't understand is that the images they're seeing on the wall, they aren't real. And they don't know that if only they stepped out of the cave, there would be more to their lives than darkness. The whole story is a conversation between two philosophers, Socrates and Glaucon, so they're both proposing different scenarios for these men's lives. In one of the scenarios, they say, well, what if one of the men was able to leave the cave? What if they set him free and he was able to walk out on his own? Well, they concluded that he most likely wouldn't like it. The minute he would step out of the cave, he would be blinded by the sun and overwhelmed by his surroundings, and we would turn around and march back into the cave, into the darkness, for the rest of his life. So then they say, well, what if some man or entity forced him out of the cave? What if they forced him to go outside for once? Well, at first he'd be uncomfortable, but then it clicks. As he adjusts to his surroundings and he becomes accustomed to the light, he finally realizes that there's this whole other world waiting for him. He just didn't know it. So then they say, well, what if he went back into the cave to tell the other prisoners about the trees, the people, and the stars? Well, while he's going back into the cave, he's adjusting to the darkness, he has a mismatched perception of the world compared to the other prisoners. So he would become a laughingstock instead of this great savior liberating them from a life of darkness. In fact, the prisoners would become offended that this man is trying to contradict premises and ideas that they've held very strong their whole lives. Because this man is going up to them and saying, hey, your entire perception of reality is wrong. So of course they're bound to be skeptical at the very least. But this ignorance, this refusal to consider any other ideas other than their own, without even a slight consideration, is what ultimately leads them to a life of darkness, literally and figuratively. Despite the fact that this story was written in 380 BC, this isn't too far from what's happening today. You have people condemning each other and refusing to listen to each other because what they believe is the only correct answer, and anything that even slightly deviates from that is wrong. You have Republicans and Democrats ridiculing each other for their outrageous policies, and yet nothing gets done. Sure, a couple insults are traded and some egos are bruised, but at the end of the day, nothing gets solved. The quote that sticks out to me the most from the allegory of the cave is this: "The idea of the good is discovered last of all, and it is only perceived with great difficulty. But when it is seen, it leads us directly to the finding that it is the universal cause of all that is right and beautiful. It is the source of visible light and the master of the same, and in the intelligible world, it is the master of truth and reason. And whoever, in private or in public, would behave in a sensible way will keep this idea in focus." To me, true knowledge and enlightenment doesn't come from simply accepting someone else's ideas. It comes from challenging your own. Most people stick to what they believe their whole lives. They stick to what they're comfortable with. And there's nothing wrong with that, with believing in what you feel confident is true. It just becomes a problem when you're ready to tear down other people simply because they've grown up in a different environment and have formed an opinion other than your own. That is when you have to get over yourself, take a step back, and look at both sides of the story, because there's never just one. Only then can you make the argument you're trying to make and come to a solution. If there's anything you take away from the allegory of the cave, it's this: don't limit yourself to staring at a rock. Step out of the cave and go experience the real world for yourself so that you can form your own opinions from all the facts, not just the ones you've been staring at. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you saw the duck or the rabbit first. It matters that you saw both, and you get the whole story. Thank you.